The art of recognizing and deflecting manipulation has never been more crucial than in our interconnected age. While Niccolò Machiavelli's writings have often been misunderstood as blueprints for ruthless behavior, they contain profound insights into human nature and the mechanics of influence that can serve as powerful defensive tools. This exploration delves into the darker currents of human interaction not to exploit them, but to understand them so thoroughly that their power over us dissolves in the shadowed corridors of a Renaissance court. Whispers carried more weight than proclamations. The young diplomat learned this lesson when his mentor, a seasoned advisor to the Medici family, pulled him aside after a particularly contentious council meeting. "You see how Count Alessandro praised your proposal while simultaneously undermining it with subtle questions about its practicality?" the older man asked. This is the first lesson: manipulation begins with the appearance of support. The essence of Machiavellian insight lies not in teaching us to become manipulators, but in revealing the fundamental patterns that manipulative individuals employ. These patterns remain remarkably consistent across centuries, cultures, and contexts because they exploit unchanging aspects of human psychology. Understanding these mechanisms creates an immunity born not of cynicism, but of awareness. The manipulator's primary weapon is the exploitation of human cognitive biases. They understand that most people prefer harmony to conflict, certainty to ambiguity, and belonging to isolation. These natural human preferences become vulnerabilities in the hands of those who understand how to weaponize them. The first step toward immunity is recognizing that these vulnerabilities exist within all of us, not as character flaws, but as inherent features of how our minds process social information. Consider the principle of reciprocity, deeply embedded in human social behavior. When someone does us a favor, we feel compelled to return it. This natural inclination maintains social bonds and cooperation, but skilled manipulators exploit it by creating artificial debts. They might offer unsolicited help, present unwanted gifts, or provide information that seems valuable but costs them nothing to share. The recipient, feeling obligated, becomes more likely to comply with subsequent requests that may be entirely disproportionate to the original gesture. The manipulation often begins subtly, with what appears to be genuine concern or interest. A colleague who suddenly starts asking about your personal life, offering coffee, or staying late to help with your projects might genuinely care, but they might also be establishing a foundation of perceived intimacy and obligation. The Machiavellian observer learns to distinguish between authentic relationship building and tactical positioning by examining the timing, consistency, and ultimate direction of such behaviors. False urgency represents another cornerstone of manipulative strategy. By creating artificial time pressure, manipulators bypass their target's rational decision-making processes. "This offer expires today, everyone else has already agreed," or "we need an answer right now," are phrases designed to trigger anxiety and prompt immediate compliance. The immune individual recognizes that legitimate opportunities rarely require instantaneous decisions, and genuine emergencies are accompanied by clear, verifiable evidence of their urgency. The sophisticated manipulator also employs what might be called emotional scaffolding, carefully constructing an emotional context that makes their target more susceptible to influence. They might begin conversations by discussing stressful situations, personal challenges, or shared frustrations, creating a state of emotional vulnerability. In this state, people become more likely to seek solutions, comfort, or validation, making them receptive to suggestions that they might otherwise scrutinize more carefully. Isolation tactics represent perhaps the most insidious form of manipulation because they operate gradually and often appear reasonable. The manipulator slowly separates their target from sources of independent perspective by suggesting that others don't understand the situation, don't have the target's best interests at heart, or are simply less capable of providing good advice. This isolation can be social, intellectual, or informational, but its purpose is always to make the target more dependent on the manipulator's perspective and less likely to seek or trust alternative viewpoints. The projection of expertise or authority constitutes another fundamental tool. Manipulators position themselves as uniquely qualified to understand the situation, whether through claimed experience, specialized knowledge, or access to exclusive information. They might reference conversations with important people, cite complex theories that are difficult to verify, or simply speak with a confidence that suggests deep knowledge. The immune individual learns to separate legitimate expertise from performed expertise by examining the substance behind the claims rather than the manner of their presentation. Machiavelli observed that effective deception often contains elements of truth, making it more difficult to detect and easier to defend. Modern manipulators employ this principle by embedding their falsehoods with inaccurate but irrelevant information, creating an overall impression of truthfulness while directing attention away from the deceptive elements. They might provide detailed and accurate background information about a situation while making false claims about its implications, or they might share genuine insights about one aspect of a problem while offering manipulative solutions for another aspect. The gradual escalation of commitment represents a particularly sophisticated manipulation technique. Rather than asking for significant compliance immediately, the manipulator begins with small requests that seem reasonable and harmless. Each act of compliance makes the next request seem more reasonable by comparison and creates a psychological commitment to the relationship or cause. This progression can lead targets to agree to actions that they would have immediately rejected if presented as an initial request. Understanding these patterns creates the foundation for immunity, but knowledge alone is insufficient. The emotional and psychological appeals that make manipulation effective operate below the level of conscious reasoning, triggering responses before rational analysis can intervene. Developing true immunity requires not just intellectual understanding but also emotional recognition and behavioral preparation. The immune individual learns to notice their own internal responses to social pressure. They become sensitive to feelings of confusion, urgency, obligation, or excitement that arise during interactions, particularly when these feelings seem disproportionate to the actual content of the conversation. They develop the habit of pausing before making commitments, regardless of how reasonable those commitments might seem, and they create mental space for reflection even in apparently time-sensitive situations. This awareness extends beyond individual interactions to encompass broader patterns of relationship and communication. The immune person notices when conversations consistently revolve around one person's needs or perspectives, when questions about their own thoughts or feelings are deflected or dismissed, or when they find themselves making exceptions to their normal boundaries or standards. These patterns often develop gradually, making them difficult to detect without deliberate attention. The cultivation of immunity also requires understanding the role of emotional states in decision-making. Manipulators excel at creating emotional contexts that favor their objectives, whether through inducing excitement, fear, gratitude, or guilt. The immune individual learns to recognize when their emotional state has been artificially influenced and develops strategies for returning to emotional equilibrium before making important decisions. Perhaps most importantly, immunity requires accepting that manipulation is a constant presence in social interaction, not because people are fundamentally evil, but because influence and persuasion exist on a spectrum. Learning to distinguish between legitimate influence and manipulative exploitation becomes an essential skill for navigating complex social environments while maintaining personal autonomy and authentic relationships. Part 2, The Psychology of Influence and Resistance. The second phase of developing immunity involves understanding the deeper psychological mechanisms that make manipulation possible and learning to strengthen our natural defenses against them. Machiavelli's insights into human nature reveal not just how people can be controlled, but also how they can develop the strength and awareness to resist control. In the bustling marketplace of Florence, a merchant watched as a customer examined his finest silk. The potential buyer handled the fabric carefully, asking detailed questions about its origin and quality. Suddenly, another customer approached, expressing urgent interest in the same piece. The first customer's demeanor changed immediately. His casual examination became focused evaluation, his thoughtful questions became quick confirmations, and, within minutes he had purchased the silk at the full asking price. The merchant's assistant, observing this interaction, began to understand how perceived scarcity and competition could override careful deliberation. This scene illustrates one of the most powerful psychological triggers that manipulators exploit: the fear of loss or missed opportunity. The human brain processes potential losses differently than potential gains, giving them disproportionate emotional weight. This loss aversion can cause people to act quickly and decisively in situations where they would normally proceed cautiously. Understanding this tendency provides the foundation for resistance, recognizing that the urgency to avoid loss is often artificial and that genuine opportunities rarely disappear without warning. The psychology of social proof represents another critical vulnerability. Humans are naturally inclined to look to others for guidance about appropriate behavior, particularly in ambiguous situations. Manipulators exploit this tendency by creating false impressions of consensus or popularity. They might reference the decisions of previous clients, the support of unnamed experts, or the enthusiasm of unspecified groups. The immune individual learns to demand specific, verifiable information about who has made these decisions and why, rather than accepting vague appeals to social consensus. Cognitive dissonance provides manipulators with one of their most powerful tools because it operates through the target's own psychological mechanisms. When people act in ways that contradict their beliefs or values, they experience uncomfortable mental tension. To reduce this discomfort, they often change their beliefs to align with their actions rather than acknowledging that they were manipulated into acting against their better judgment. A skilled manipulator can create small acts of compliance that gradually shift the target's self-perception and beliefs in the desired direction. The development of psychological immunity requires understanding these mechanisms well enough to interrupt them when they begin operating. This interruption doesn't require eliminating the underlying psychological tendencies, which would be neither possible nor desirable, but rather developing the awareness to recognize when they are being artificially triggered and the skills to pause the automatic response long enough for rational evaluation. One of the most effective techniques for building this immunity involves what might be called perspective multiplication. Rather than accepting any single interpretation of a situation, the immune individual habitually considers multiple possible explanations for events and behaviors. When someone offers a favor, they consider not only the possibility of genuine kindness but also potential ulterior motives. When presented with an urgent decision, they consider not only the stated reasons for urgency but also who benefits from quick action and who might benefit from delayed consideration. This practice of perspective multiplication doesn't lead to paranoia or cynicism when applied skillfully. Instead, it creates a more complete understanding of complex situations and provides protection against manipulation that relies on narrow or self-serving interpretations. The key lies in considering multiple perspectives without necessarily believing any of them completely until sufficient evidence supports a particular interpretation. The cultivation of emotional regulation represents another crucial component of psychological immunity. Manipulators excel at creating emotional states that favor their objectives: excitement that overrides careful consideration, fear that promotes quick compliance, or guilt that weakens resistance to unreasonable requests. The immune individual develops the ability to recognize when their emotional state has been influenced by external factors and to restore emotional balance before making important decisions. This emotional regulation doesn't require suppressing all emotions or becoming coldly analytical in every situation. Rather, it involves developing sensitivity to emotional manipulation and the skills to maintain emotional choice even under pressure. When someone attempts to make you feel guilty for establishing boundaries, you recognize the manipulation while still allowing yourself to feel appropriate concern for others. When someone tries to create artificial excitement about an opportunity, you can appreciate genuine enthusiasm while maintaining perspective about potential risks or downsides. The practice of delayed response provides a powerful tool for maintaining autonomy in the face of social pressure. Many manipulative techniques rely on immediate compliance before the target has time to consider alternatives or consult other perspectives. The immune individual develops the habit of creating space between social pressure and response, regardless of how urgent or reasonable the request might seem. This space might last minutes, hours, or days depending on the significance of the decision, but its consistent application neutralizes many common manipulation tactics. Developing this practice requires overcoming the social conditioning that equates immediate response with politeness or competence. In reality, thoughtful response demonstrates respect for both oneself and the person making the request. A legitimate request will remain legitimate after consideration, while a manipulative one will often reveal its true nature when subjected to reflection and analysis. The cultivation of independence in thought and judgment represents perhaps the most fundamental aspect of psychological immunity. This independence doesn't mean rejecting all input from others or making decisions in isolation, but rather developing the confidence to form judgments based on personal values and reasoning rather than social pressure. The immune individual learns to distinguish between gathering information and advice from others versus allowing others to make decisions for them. This independence requires understanding and accepting personal responsibility for decisions and their consequences. Manipulators often exploit people's desire to avoid responsibility by positioning themselves as the decision makers while claiming to act in the target's best interest. They might say things like, "Don't worry about the details, I'll handle everything," or "Trust me, this is what's best for you." The immune individual recognizes that outsourcing decision-making authority also means outsourcing control over outcomes and that no one else can be fully trusted to prioritize another person's genuine interests. The development of personal boundaries represents another essential element of psychological immunity. Boundaries aren't walls that prevent all influence or connection with others, but rather guidelines that preserve personal autonomy and authentic relationships. These boundaries might involve limiting the types of requests one will consider, the time frame for making decisions, or the amount of personal information one shares with different people. Effective boundaries are both clear and flexible, clear enough to provide guidance in challenging situations, but flexible enough to adapt to genuine changes in circumstances or relationships. The immune individual learns to articulate these boundaries clearly and to maintain them consistently, even when doing so creates temporary social discomfort or disappointment in others. Perhaps most importantly, psychological immunity requires developing comfort with uncertainty and imperfection. Many manipulation techniques exploit people's desire for certainty, clear answers, and guaranteed outcomes. The manipulator positions themselves as someone who can provide these things, often in situations where certainty is genuinely impossible. The immune individual learns to tolerate uncertainty and to make decisions based on incomplete information rather than accepting false certainty from manipulative sources. This tolerance for uncertainty extends to relationships and social situations. The immune person accepts that they cannot control how others perceive or respond to them and that maintaining personal autonomy sometimes means accepting temporary conflict or misunderstanding. This acceptance paradoxically often leads to stronger and more authentic relationships because it eliminates the desperate need for approval that manipulators exploit. Part 3: The practice of sovereign thinking. The final phase of developing immunity to manipulation involves integrating awareness and resistance into a comprehensive approach to thinking and decision-making that preserves autonomy while maintaining meaningful connections with others. This represents the highest level of Machiavellian wisdom, understanding human nature deeply enough to navigate its complexities without becoming cynical or isolated. In the private study of a Venetian palazzo, an aging philosopher reflected on decades of observing human behavior in courts, markets, and salons. He had witnessed countless intrigues, betrayals, and manipulation, but he had also seen genuine friendship, principled leadership, and authentic collaboration. The difference, he realized, lay not in the absence of self-interest, for all human action contains some element of self-interest, but in the transparency of that interest and the methods used to pursue it. Sovereign thinking begins with the recognition that all human interaction involves attempts at influence. Parents influence children, teachers influence students, friends influence each other, and leaders influence followers. The question is not whether influence will occur, but whether it will be transparent, mutual, and respectful of autonomy, or whether it will be deceptive, one-sided, and controlling. The sovereign thinker learns to evaluate influence attempts based on these criteria rather than trying to eliminate influence entirely. When someone attempts to persuade them, they ask whether the persuader's interests are clearly stated, whether their own interests and concerns are being considered, and whether they are being provided with complete information necessary to make an informed decision. This evaluation allows them to distinguish between legitimate persuasion and manipulative control. This distinction requires understanding the difference between influence that enhances the target's agency and influence that diminishes it. Legitimate influence provides information, perspectives, and options that help the target make better decisions according to their own values and objectives. Manipulative influence restricts information, eliminates options, and attempts to override the target's decision-making processes. The sovereign thinker consistently chooses interactions that enhance rather than diminish their capacity for autonomous choice. The practice of sovereign thinking also involves developing what might be called strategic empathy, the ability to understand others' perspectives and motivations without automatically accepting their conclusions or complying with their requests. This empathy allows the sovereign thinker to respond effectively to others' needs and concerns while maintaining clear boundaries about their own interests and values. Strategic empathy requires distinguishing between understanding someone's emotions and taking responsibility for managing those emotions. A manipulator might express hurt, disappointment, or anger when their requests are declined, hoping to trigger guilt or anxiety that will lead to compliance. The sovereign thinker can acknowledge and even empathize with these emotions without accepting responsibility for causing or resolving them, particularly when the emotions arise from unreasonable expectations or manipulative tactics. This emotional independence doesn't mean becoming callous or indifferent to others' feelings. Rather, it means maintaining clarity about emotional responsibility and refusing to allow others' emotional states to override personal judgment. The sovereign thinker learns to respond to others' emotions with compassion while maintaining autonomy over their own decisions and actions. The cultivation of information independence represents another crucial aspect of sovereign thinking. In an age of abundant information but questionable sources, the ability to verify claims and seek multiple perspectives becomes essential for maintaining autonomy. The sovereign thinker develops habits of fact-checking, source verification, and perspective-seeking that protect against manipulation through false or misleading information. This information independence involves understanding the difference between expertise and authority. True expertise can be verified through credentials, experience, and track records, while false authority relies on position, confidence, or social dynamics. The sovereign thinker learns to evaluate the substance of claims rather than the status of those making them, and to seek input from multiple qualified sources rather than accepting single authoritative pronouncements. The development of decision-making frameworks provides structure for maintaining autonomy under pressure. These frameworks might include criteria for evaluating opportunities, standards for accepting commitments, or processes for making significant choices. Having clear frameworks established in advance makes it easier to resist manipulation during emotionally charged or time-pressured situations. These frameworks should be both personal and flexible, reflecting individual values and circumstances while allowing for adaptation as situations change. The sovereign thinker regularly reviews and refines their decision-making criteria, ensuring that they remain relevant and effective while resisting attempts by others to override or manipulate these standards. The practice of sovereign thinking requires developing comfort with saying no and maintaining boundaries even when doing so creates social friction. This comfort comes not from indifference to others but from understanding that clear boundaries actually enable more authentic and sustainable relationships. When personal limits are consistently communicated and maintained, others learn to interact more respectfully and honestly. Learning to say no effectively involves several key principles. First, the sovereign thinker provides clear, honest reasons for their decision without feeling obligated to justify every detail or convince the other person of the decision's correctness. Second, they avoid apologizing for having limits or needs, recognizing that boundaries are necessary for healthy relationships rather than character flaws requiring excuse. Third, they resist the temptation to provide extensive explanations that might be interpreted as invitations to debate or negotiate. A clear no with a brief explanation is more effective than a lengthy justification that suggests the decision is tentative or subject to persuasion. Fourth, they remain open to providing additional information if requested, but they don't allow requests for clarification to become demands for reconsideration. The sovereign thinker also develops skills for redirecting manipulative conversations toward more productive ground. When someone attempts to use guilt, fear, or obligation to influence a decision, the sovereign thinker acknowledges the underlying concern while redirecting attention to the actual merits of the situation. They might say something like, "I understand this is important to you, but I need to evaluate it based on whether it aligns with my current priorities and capabilities." This redirection technique prevents manipulation while maintaining respect for the other person's interests and concerns. It also creates opportunities for more honest and productive discussion about how different needs and interests might be addressed without compromising anyone's autonomy. Perhaps most importantly, sovereign thinking involves understanding that immunity to manipulation is not a destination but a practice. Human psychology remains susceptible to influence throughout life, and new manipulation techniques continue to evolve as technology and social structures change. The sovereign thinker remains vigilant and continues learning, adapting their awareness and resistance strategies to address emerging challenges. This ongoing practice requires humility about personal limitations and fallibility. Even the most aware and prepared individuals can be caught off guard by particularly sophisticated manipulation or during times of stress, exhaustion, or emotional vulnerability. The sovereign thinker learns from these experiences rather than viewing them as personal failures, using them to strengthen future resistance and awareness. The ultimate goal of sovereign thinking is not to eliminate all vulnerability to influence, but to ensure that influence occurs on terms that respect personal autonomy and authentic choice. This allows the sovereign thinker to benefit from the wisdom, perspective, and support of others while maintaining ultimate responsibility for their own decisions and their consequences. In achieving this balance, the sovereign thinker discovers that immunity to manipulation actually enhances rather than diminishes their capacity for meaningful relationships and effective collaboration. When people know that they cannot be manipulated, others are more likely to interact honestly and directly. When personal boundaries are clear and consistent, trust can develop more readily because the terms of interaction are transparent and predictable. The sovereign thinker thus becomes not isolated and suspicious, but rather more deeply connected to others through relationships based on mutual respect rather than manipulation or control. They can afford to be generous and open because their autonomy is not threatened by others' attempts at influence. They can collaborate effectively because they bring their authentic selves to interactions rather than defensive or reactive versions of themselves. This represents the highest achievement of Machiavellian wisdom, not the cynical manipulation of others, but the sophisticated understanding of human nature that allows for both self-protection and genuine connection. In learning to recognize and resist manipulation, we develop not just immunity to control, but the capacity for relationships and decisions based on truth, respect, and authentic choice. The path to this immunity requires patience, practice, and continuous learning. It demands the courage to face uncomfortable truths about human nature while maintaining hope for human potential. Most importantly, it requires the commitment to use this knowledge not for exploitation but for liberation, freeing ourselves and others from the subtle tyrannies that diminish human dignity and choice. In mastering these lessons, we discover that the greatest protection against manipulation is not suspicion or isolation, but rather the development of such clear self-knowledge and strong personal boundaries that manipulative tactics simply cannot find purchase. We become like well-fortified cities that can afford to keep their gates open because their defenses are so strong and their inhabitants so well prepared that conquest becomes impossible even when entry is permitted. This is the ultimate teaching that emerges from studying the darker aspects of human nature, that understanding shadow creates the possibility for authentic light, and that the deepest wisdom about manipulation serves not to enable control but to ensure freedom.